Whispers in the cotton fields. Beneath the songs of labor and sorrow, secret messages travel. Words of hope hidden in melodies no overseer could understand. The sun beat down on the endless fields of cotton, the air thick with dust and despair. From dawn till dusk, the rhythmic crack of the overseer's whip echoed through the plantations of the American South. To the slave masters, it was the sound of obedience. But beneath that cruel rhythm, another beat pulsed. It was the quiet hum of resistance. They called them work songs, spirituals, or field chants. But to the enslaved men and women who sang them, they were more than just a way to survive the monotony of labor. They were maps, codes, and messages of liberation. The songs carried secrets, traveling on the warm winds of the Mississippi, whispering of escape, courage, and freedom. The hidden language of song. The enslaved were forbidden to read or write. Every word, every glance was watched. Yet within the confines of the fields, music became their language of rebellion. A melody sung in harmony could tell a story. A slight change in rhythm could mean danger or opportunity. Wade in the water, they sang, and to those who knew the meaning, it wasn't just a song of baptism. It was a warning. Walk through the rivers to throw off the scent of the hounds. Follow the drinking gourd spoke of a great bear in the sky, the Big Dipper, pointing the way north to freedom. To an overseer, it was a strange, almost childlike tune. To the enslaved, it was a map of stars. Every note, every verse carried the wisdom of generations. It was the Underground Railroad before the railroad, a symphony of survival disguised as worship, a melody of defiance. In the deep fields of Georgia, a young woman named Liza was known for her voice. She could turn any sorrow into song, her voice rising above the cotton rows like a prayer. But few knew that Liza was also a conductor, not of trains, but of souls. Late at night, when the overseers slept, she would hum softly near the cabins, steal away to Jesus." Those words meant more than salvation. It was a call to gather, a sign that someone was ready to run. Liza's songs were her weapon. By day, they sounded like hymns. By night, they became the coded soundtrack of the Underground Railroad. Her voice carried through the woods, across rivers, guiding fugitives to safe houses lit by hidden lanterns. The Underground Symphony. Freedom had no single path. It was a network of whispers, handshakes, and hymns. The Underground Railroad wasn't actually a railroad. It was an invisible chain of safe houses and brave souls, black and white alike, bound together by conscience and courage. Conductors like Harriet Tubman, herself an escaped slave, depended on these secret codes. Tubman used songs to communicate when silence was safer than speech. When she sang "Go Down, Moses," it was time to prepare. When she changed the tempo, it meant danger was near. Each song was a key, and only the oppressed knew how to unlock its meaning. Danger in every note. To be caught singing the wrong song could mean death. Slave patrols roamed the countryside, hunting escapees and punishing anyone suspected of helping them. Yet still, the music played on. The songs offered more than escape routes. They offered hope. They gave people who had been stripped of everything a reason to believe that somewhere, beyond the horizon, freedom waited. When the night air filled with the soft hum of "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," the enslaved would close their eyes and imagine that chariot carrying them home, not to heaven, but to a land where they could walk as free men and women. A nation awakens. As the whispers grew louder, the world began to listen. Abolitionists in the North printed stories about the coded songs, marveling at the brilliance of a people who had turned oppression into art. Preachers in Philadelphia and Boston spoke of the spirituals as divine proof that God stood with the enslaved. By the time the Civil War erupted, many of these songs had traveled far beyond the plantations. Union soldiers sang them in camps. Freedmen sang them in celebration. The same melodies that once disguised rebellion now thundered as anthems of victory. The legacy in the music. Long after the last chains were broken, the songs remained. They evolved into gospel, blues, and eventually the heart of American music itself. Every rhythm of jazz, every verse of soul, carried echoes of those first whispers in the cotton fields. The enslaved may not have had pen or paper, but they had rhythm, they had faith, and through their songs they preserved history, a history of courage, intelligence, and defiance. Even today, when a choir sings "Wade in the Water" or "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," they're not just performing, they're remembering the voices that refuse to be silenced, remembering that freedom was once sung before it was ever won. The song that couldn't be silenced. In a world built on silence, they found their voice. In a time of bondage, they composed freedom. The overseers thought they were just singing to ease their pain, but the truth was far greater. They were writing the first verses of America's most powerful story, the story of resilience, unity, and the unbreakable rhythm of hope. From the cotton fields of Mississippi to the halls of Harlem, their songs have never stopped echoing, because freedom, once sung, never fades.
A map written in the stars. Under moonlit skies, the North Star became a compass of freedom, guiding those brave enough to run through darkness toward the dawn. The night was silent, except for the rustling of leaves and the distant croak of a frog. Somewhere deep in the woods of Alabama, a man crouched low, his eyes fixed on a single shimmering point in the sky, the North Star. To most, it was just another celestial light, steady, unmoving. But to him and countless others like him, it was salvation. They called it the drinking gourd. For generations, enslaved African Americans whispered about it in coded songs. Follow the drinking gourd, for the old man is waiting to carry you to freedom. The old man was a guide. The drinking gourd was the Big Dipper, and its handle pointed straight to the North Star, the key to liberty. This was the map that couldn't be burned, banned, or betrayed. It was written not on paper, but in the heavens, and those who dared to read it were rewriting the meaning of freedom itself. The celestial compass. Before compasses and GPS, the night sky was the only guide for those escaping slavery. The enslaved learned to read the stars from African traditions, the same knowledge their ancestors once used to navigate deserts and jungles. When white masters thought they were singing hymns, they were really practicing astronomy in plain sight. In the South, the North Star, or Polaris, became the most important symbol of the Underground Railroad. Unlike other stars, it never moved. It stayed fixed, marking the direction to the Free States, and eventually to Canada, the true Promised Land. For the enslaved, it meant something more profound than science. It meant hope. It meant there was something constant in a world that kept changing against their will. The Night of the Runaways. In 1849, 3 men and a woman set out from a plantation near Natchez, Mississippi. They carried no weapons, no food, only courage and the whispered words of a song. When the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. They waited until the plantation fell silent. Then, barefoot and trembling, they slipped into the woods. The woman, Ruth, led them northward, her eyes constantly lifting to the stars. She had learned from her father how to find the Big Dipper. He told her, "The 2 stars at the edge, they point to the North Star. Follow that, and the Lord will guide you." For weeks they traveled at night, through swamps, across rivers, hiding by day in abandoned barns and dense thickets. Sometimes they followed the stars, other times they followed whispers, the faint network of safe houses that would later be known as the Underground Railroad. Every step was a gamble. Slave catchers roamed the countryside, offering rewards for fugitives. But the stars above were incorruptible. No one could buy them, lie through them, or lock them away. The conductor who trusted the sky. Many who escaped left behind no names, no records, just legends. But one conductor who embraced the starlit path was Levi Coffin, a Quaker abolitionist from Indiana. His home became one of the most vital stations on the Underground Railroad. Coffin and his wife Catherine sheltered over 2,000 fugitives, many of whom arrived after following the North Star across the Ohio River. They described the same celestial journey, nights of fear and beauty, hunger and faith, guided always by that unblinking light. One fugitive once told Coffin, "When I saw that star, I knew God had hung it there just for me." Even Harriet Tubman herself, the legendary Moses of the Underground Railroad, used the night sky to guide her. She would whisper to her passengers, "Keep your eyes to the heavens. That star will not lead you wrong." The science of freedom. What's astonishing is how accurate their methods were. Polaris sits almost directly above Earth's North Pole, meaning that when you face it, you're facing north. The angle of the star in the sky even changes with latitude, a subtle clue for those who learn to read it. For people denied the right to education, to study the sky this way was an act of quiet genius. It was rebellion through knowledge, the reclaiming of science as a tool of liberation. While enslavers tried to strip them of humanity, they reached for the infinite, finding freedom written among the constellations. The final crossing. After nearly 2 months of travel, Ruth and her companions finally reached the Ohio River. On the far side lay freedom and the start of a new life. The river was swollen with spring rain, but retreat was not an option. As they waited for nightfall, the clouds covered the stars, and for the first time, Ruth couldn't find her compass. Panic rose. The darkness felt endless. Then, just before dawn, the clouds parted. There it was, Polaris, steady as ever. Ruth dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. The North Star had found her once more. By sunrise, they had crossed into Ohio. Ruth would later settle in Canada, working as a nurse and teaching her children the same lessons her father had taught her, how to find the North Star and how to never lose it in their hearts. The star that never fades. When the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, the North Star became a lasting symbol in African American culture. Churches were named after it. Newspapers took its name. Most famously, Frederick Douglass's abolitionist paper, The North Star, first published in 1847. Its message was simple yet eternal. Right is of no sex. Truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren. Even today, the North Star continues to shine over America, a silent witness to the nights when men and women risked everything to follow its light.
Harriet's Torch. Harriet Tubman, the Moses of her people, led dozens from bondage to liberty, carrying a pistol, a prayer, and an unshakable faith. The sound of barking dogs cut through the night. Harriet froze, her hand instinctively tightening around the small pistol tucked beneath her shawl. Behind her, a group of fugitives huddled in the shadows, trembling. The moonlight glinted off their frightened eyes. "Keep moving," she whispered. "Freedom's just ahead." That was the way of Harriet Tubman, fearless, steady, and guided by something greater than fear. To the world, she was a small, quiet woman born into slavery. To those who followed her, she was Moses, the deliverer who lit the path from bondage to liberty. A child of chains and fire. Harriet was born Araminta Ross around 1822 on a Maryland plantation. From her earliest years, she knew the sting of the whip and the weight of oppression. She was hired out to cruel masters, beaten for the smallest mistakes, and nearly killed when a slave owner hurled a 2-pound weight at her head, a blow that left her with lifelong seizures and visions she called divine messages. To the masters, her fainting spells were weakness. To Harriet, they were something else, signs that God had chosen her for a purpose. "I always told God, I'm going to hold steady to you, and you've got to see me through," she later said. By her late 20s, she could no longer bear the chains. One cold night in 1849, she fled her plantation alone. She followed the North Star through swamps and forests, crossed the Mason-Dixon line, and reached Philadelphia, free soil at last. But freedom, she realized, meant little if she left her family behind. "I had reasoned this out in my mind," she said later. "There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other." The birth of a conductor. Within a year of her escape, Harriet made a fateful choice: to go back. Against every instinct of survival, she returned south to rescue her loved ones. That first journey was just the beginning. Over the next decade, she would make at least 13 daring missions along the Underground Railroad, leading more than 70 enslaved people to freedom and helping hundreds more through her network of contacts. She used everything: disguise, deception, and divine intuition. She carried a pistol not for the slave catchers, but for anyone in her group who might lose their nerve and turn back. "You'll be free or you'll die here," she warned. Each journey was a miracle of planning. She timed departures with the full moon, used songs as coded messages, and trusted safe houses hidden in the countryside, homes of Quakers, free blacks, and abolitionists like Thomas Garrett and William Still. The woman who couldn't be caught. Slave owners put a $40,000 bounty on her head, an enormous sum at the time, but no one ever captured her. She moved like a ghost through the marshes and pine woods, her footsteps erased by the wind. She often said her faith guided her like a compass. "I always told my people, if you hear the dogs, keep going. If you see the torches, keep going. If you want a taste of freedom, keep going." When danger drew near, she'd pray aloud for divine help. On one occasion, when patrols blocked the road ahead, she simply knelt and said, "Lord, you've always been my guide. Show me the way." Minutes later, an owl's hoot echoed from the woods, a sound she took as a sign. She turned the group down a different path and found safety. Some called her visions superstitions. Others called them miracles. Either way, they kept her alive. A network of courage. The Underground Railroad was not a literal railroad, but a network of courage, conductors like Harriet, stations that offered shelter, and passengers risking everything for a chance at freedom. Harriet's routes stretched from Maryland to Delaware, through Pennsylvania, and into Canada, where slavery was outlawed. Each journey could take weeks. The fugitives traveled by night, resting in barns or root cellars by day. When they finally crossed into Canada, Harriet would lead them in song. Glory to God and Jesus too. One more soul is safe. She never lost a single passenger. Beyond the railroad. When the Civil War erupted, Harriet didn't rest. She joined the Union Army as a nurse, cook, and eventually as a spy for the Northern forces. Using the same stealth that once helped her free the enslaved, she gathered intelligence behind Confederate lines and guided troops through treacherous terrain. In 1863, she helped plan and lead the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina, a mission that freed more than 700 enslaved people in one single night. It was the first military operation in U.S. history led by a woman. From slave to liberator to war hero, Harriet's journey was nothing short of biblical. The flame that never died. After the war, Harriet settled in Auburn, New York, where she opened a home for the elderly and continued her lifelong fight for equality. She worked alongside Susan Anthony in the suffrage movement, insisting that the struggle for freedom was not over until all were equal. When asked if she was ever afraid, she replied, "I can't die but once." By the time of her death in 1913, she was one of the most admired women in America, though she died nearly penniless, giving away everything she had to others. Yet her legacy blazed on.
The Silent Network. Ordinary men and women, farmers, preachers, and even Quakers risked everything to hide fugitives in barns, cellars, and false walls. The knock came after midnight. 3 slow taps, then 2 quick ones. Inside a farmhouse near Lancaster, Pennsylvania, a candle flickered to life. The farmer's wife, her hands trembling, moved quietly to the door. "Who's there?" she whispered. A voice came from the darkness. "Friends of friends." That was the password. Without another word, she unlatched the door, letting in a cold gust of air, and with it 2 men and a young girl, their clothes torn, their faces streaked with mud. They had traveled for days, guided by whispers, songs, and the light of the North Star. Tonight they would rest. Tomorrow they would move again. They were passengers on the Underground Railroad, and this house, an unassuming farmhouse on the edge of a quiet field, was one of its secret stations. The Invisible Highway. In the mid-1800s, when slavery still ruled the South, a vast invisible network stretched across the American landscape, not of iron tracks and steam engines, but of courage, conscience, and silence. It was called the Underground Railroad, not because it was underground nor a railroad, but because of its secrecy and coordination. Each stop was a station. Each helper was a conductor. Each escapee was a passenger. There were no maps, no written instructions, only faith and human bravery. A lantern left burning in a window, a quilt with a specific pattern draped over a fence, or a phrase like "the friend of a friend" might signal that a house was safe. And behind this web of coded messages stood an army of ordinary people, farmers, preachers, and even Quakers, united by one belief, that no human should live in chains. The Quaker Code. Among the most active supporters were the Quakers, or the Society of Friends, a religious community known for their plain dress, simple speech, and fierce devotion to equality. In states like Pennsylvania and Ohio, Quaker families turned their homes into sanctuaries. They hid fugitives beneath floorboards and behind false walls built into barns. One Quaker couple, Thomas and Hannah Atkinson, hosted dozens of runaways in their home. Their children were taught never to ask names or share secrets. It is better not to know, so that no man can force the truth from your tongue. They would cook meals for their hidden guests, patch their clothes, and at dawn guide them to the next safe station, sometimes just a few miles away, sometimes across the Ohio River into freedom. To be caught meant ruin. Federal law under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 punished anyone who aided an escaped slave with fines and imprisonment. Yet the Quakers and countless others persisted, choosing morality over law. The Farmer's Secret. In the farmlands of Indiana, Levi and Catherine Coffin became the most famous conductors of all. Their home, known as the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad, sheltered over 2,000 fugitives during their lifetimes. Every escape was a puzzle. The Coffins would disguise fugitives as farmhands, washerwomen, or stable workers. Levi often hid them in wagons filled with hay, driving them past patrols under the guise of ordinary chores. When neighbors grew suspicious, Catherine would bake more bread than usual, using the aroma to mask the smell of extra bodies hiding beneath the floorboards. "No one goes hungry in our house," she'd smile to visitors, her secret safe behind her calm voice. The preachers and the bells. Churches, too, became silent allies. In the border states, sermons were often coded messages. Ministers preached about the promised land, deliverance, and the journey through the wilderness, phrases that slaves and sympathizers alike understood as metaphors for escape. Some churches rang their bells at midnight, not for service, but as signals that it was safe to move. Others carved trapdoors beneath their pulpits, creating hiding places for those waiting for the next conductor. Even in the North, where slavery was illegal, danger was constant. Slave catchers roamed freely under federal protection, hunting fugitives for profit. The silent network responded not with weapons, but with secrecy, speed, and faith. The cost of compassion. For every act of heroism, there was risk. Many were caught, fined, or beaten. Some lost their homes, others their lives, but few regretted it. In 1851, a Maryland farmer named Samuel Green, a free black man, was arrested after a copy of Uncle Tom Cabin, considered abolitionist propaganda, was found in his home. He spent 10 years in prison. His only crime was compassion. And yet the network endured. For every station destroyed, 2 more rose in its place. They believed freedom was contagious and worth the cost. The hidden map. Though many records were destroyed to protect those involved, historians have pieced together fragments of the network. In Ohio alone, over 3,000 miles of routes once connected hundreds of safe houses. In one farmhouse near Oberlin, researchers found an old trapdoor under the floorboards, leading to a tiny space just big enough for 2 people. In another home in New York, a false wall revealed a narrow passage to the attic, a relic of a time when silence meant survival. These weren't just architectural oddities. They were the last echoes of an invisible army that changed history without firing a shot. The unseen heroes. While figures like Harriet Tubman became legends, the Underground Railroad was sustained by countless unsung heroes. There was the blacksmith who shoed horses for escapees, the seamstress who stitched coded quilts, the innkeeper who slipped keys to locked rooms, and the ferryman who rowed passengers across dark rivers without asking questions. They did not do it for glory. They did it because conscience demanded it.
Imagine running barefoot through a swamp at midnight, your breath frozen, your heart pounding, dogs howling in the distance. One wrong step, one broken twig, and everything you've risked for freedom could vanish in chains. This was not fiction. This was the brutal reality faced by thousands of enslaved men and women who dared to follow the whisper of freedom along the Underground Railroad. Freedom, to those born in bondage, was not just a dream. It was a fire that refused to die. In the 1840s and 1850s, across the American South, enslaved people began to vanish under the cover of night. They weren't running aimlessly. They followed hidden routes, a web of secret trails, safe houses, and coded songs known as the Underground Railroad. But this railroad had no tracks and no trains. Its passengers traveled by foot, wagon, or riverboat, guided not by maps, but by faith, courage, and the constellations above. Every mile carried danger. Slave catchers roamed the countryside, armed with whips, muskets, and bloodhounds. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 turned even northern towns into hunting grounds, forcing freedom seekers to move in silence or risk being dragged back into slavery. Among them was Samuel, a young man from a plantation near Natchez, Mississippi. He had seen his wife sold to a trader bound for Georgia, a wound that never healed. For 2 years he planned. He memorized the stars, learned which rivers flowed north, and found allies who spoke in codes. When he finally ran, the night was moonless. His only guide was the North Star, Polaris, shining steady above the horizon. To Samuel, it was more than light, it was salvation. He crossed fields barefoot, hid in thickets during the day, and followed the whispers of freedom at night. Sometimes he met strangers who offered a crust of bread, a sip of water, or directions to the next station. One was a Quaker farmer named Thomas Garrett in Delaware, who had helped more than 2,700 fugitives reach safety. To harbor an escaped slave was a federal crime, yet Garrett never hesitated. "Every man has a right to liberty," he once said, even as courts fined him into ruin. The Underground Railroad was not a single organization, it was a silent network of humanity. Preachers used Bible verses to share routes. Quilts hung on fences carried patterns that signaled safety or danger. Black and white, rich and poor, men and women, all took part. Harriet Tubman, the legendary Moses of her people, made over 12 trips south, guiding more than 70 people to freedom. She carried a pistol, not for violence, but to ensure no one lost their nerve and turned back. "You'll be free," she told them, "or you'll die here." For every success story, dozens were caught. The price of freedom was steep, sometimes death itself. Those captured faced brutal whippings, iron collars, or worse. Slave catchers earned bounties worth hundreds of dollars, a fortune at the time. Some fugitives were betrayed by informants, others tracked by dogs trained to follow the scent of sweat and fear. Yet still they ran, because bondage, they knew, was a slower death. As Samuel journeyed north,
He passed through swamps thick with mosquitoes, slept in hollow trees, and once swam across the Ohio River with freezing water biting his skin. When dawn broke, he stumbled into the arms of a woman known as Aunt Rachel, who ran a safe house on the Indiana border. She gave him bread, washed his feet, and whispered, "You're almost there, child. Canada's not far now." Canada, the promised land. Beyond the reach of American law, it became the final refuge for thousands who escaped. By 1860, nearly 30,000 freedom seekers had crossed into Ontario, where black communities built churches, schools, and farms. Samuel was among them. When the Civil War erupted a year later, he joined the Union Army, fighting not just for his freedom, but for those still in chains. But even after the Emancipation Proclamation, the scars of those perilous journeys remained. The Underground Railroad became legend, its routes fading into history, yet its spirit enduring in every act of courage that defies oppression. Those who ran and those who helped changed the moral fabric of a nation. They taught America that freedom has a price, not measured in gold, but in courage, sacrifice, and hope. Today, across the U.S., markers and museums trace the paths of the Underground Railroad in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and beyond. Visitors can walk through restored safe houses, where trapdoors and false walls once hid men, women, and children who refused to be broken. Their stories remind us that liberty was never handed down. It was fought for in the dark, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat.
The code of the North quilts hung on fences, lanterns in windows, and verses in hymns, each a signal in a vast, invisible web of rebellion. A patchwork quilt fluttering in the breeze, a lantern glowing faintly in a farmhouse window, a line from an old spiritual sung in the fields, "Follow the drinking gourd." To most, these were harmless details of rural life, but to those who understood, they were messages, signs of hope and direction. Beneath the watchful eyes of masters and slave catchers, a secret language was being spoken across the American South, a code that pointed the way to freedom. In the mid-1800s, slavery's shadow stretched across half of America. Cotton was king, and the lives of millions were bound to it. Yet even under the cruelest conditions, enslaved people found ways to resist, quietly, cleverly, and courageously. The Underground Railroad wasn't made of steel or steam. It was woven through whispers, faith, and ingenuity. And among its most mysterious tools were the coded signals, patterns hidden in plain sight. One of the most remarkable systems involved quilts. These colorful patchworks, stitched by enslaved women or sympathetic allies, were far more than household decorations. Each square told a story, and sometimes a warning. The monkey wrench pattern meant to gather tools and prepare to leave. The log cabin design, with its black center square, marked a safe house. A wagon wheel urged travelers to keep moving. When hung on a fence or clothesline, the order of quilts could map an entire escape route northward. No overseer ever suspected a quilt could be a blueprint for rebellion, but to those in the know, it was a silent guide to freedom. Beyond quilts, the code extended into the rhythm of daily life. Songs sung during labor or prayer carried hidden directions. Follow the drinking gourd told listeners to use the Big Dipper constellation to find the North Star, Polaris, the celestial compass pointing toward freedom. Another hymn, Wade in the Water, warned fugitives to travel through rivers and streams to throw off the scent of the hunting dogs. To the untrained ear, these songs were simple expressions of faith.
but to the enslaved, they were sacred maps disguised as melody, a lifeline disguised as worship. Even the lanterns in windows held meaning. In border states like Maryland and Pennsylvania, where the line between slavery and freedom was perilously thin, Quaker families and abolitionists devised their own signs. A single lantern burning in an upstairs window meant the station or safe house was open. A candle placed near the door meant move quickly, danger nearby. Entire families risked imprisonment to keep that light shining. One such home belonged to Levi Coffin in Indiana, known as the president of the Underground Railroad. His house contained secret rooms and trapdoors where fugitives could hide for days. At night, Coffin's wife Catherine would hang a patterned quilt on their fence, a signal to the next conductor down the line. Over the years, they helped more than 3,000 freedom seekers reach safety. But these codes were not merely practical. They were acts of defiance in a world built on silence. Every symbol, every hidden song was a declaration that enslaved people refused to be broken. Their knowledge of nature, geography, and human kindness became weapons against tyranny. Even in darkness, they learned to read the stars, the wind, and the kindness of strangers. In one recorded story from the 1850s, a young woman named Eliza fled from Kentucky with her infant child. She had memorized quilt patterns sewn by her grandmother, who whispered their meanings during long nights of spinning and stitching. Eliza followed those patterns north, crossing frozen rivers and sleeping in barns until she reached a farmhouse in Ohio. There, a single lantern glowed in the window, just as the quilt had promised. She had arrived at a safe station. Months later, Eliza reached Canada, free at last. By 1860, as tensions between North and South exploded into civil war, the secret codes of the Underground Railroad had saved thousands. Yet many of their details were never written down deliberately to protect those still enslaved. Some historians still debate whether the quilt code existed exactly as remembered, but the truth remains: communication through symbols and song played an essential role in America's greatest underground resistance. Whether through patterns, prayers, or lights, enslaved people forged a communication network so subtle and brilliant that it slipped right past the eyes of their oppressors. It was the language of liberation, born not in books or speeches, but in whispers and stitches, hymns and hope. When freedom finally came in 1865, the symbols faded from daily life, but their legacy endured. Many quilts from that era survive today in museums, their colors faded, their threads frayed, but their stories still vibrant. They remind us that freedom was not given, it was crafted, one piece, one verse, one lantern at a time. Every patch of cloth, every flicker of light, every note of a song carried the same message: you are not alone. Keep going. North is freedom.
Crossing the line. The Ohio River shimmered like salvation. One step across meant freedom, but one misstep could mean death. The moon shimmered on the Ohio River like a silver blade, beautiful, cold, and deadly. For those who stood trembling on its southern bank, it was more than a river. It was a border between bondage and liberty, between life and death. One step across, and the world changed forever. For thousands of enslaved men and women in the American South, the Ohio River was the last great obstacle on the path to freedom. It separated slave-holding Kentucky and Virginia from the free states of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Yet calling it a river was almost too simple. To the enslaved, it was a test, a divine threshold that demanded courage, faith, and luck. During the height of the Underground Railroad in the 1840s and 1850s, countless fugitives made their way north, guided by whispers, songs, and secret symbols. But when they reached the Ohio, many froze. It stretched wide, cold, and unpredictable, especially in winter when ice floated like shattered glass. Slave catchers patrolled its crossings, and towns on both banks hid both allies and enemies. Still, for the desperate, the choice was clear: cross or die trying. One night in 1851, under a thin crescent moon, a young man named Josiah reached the river near Ripley, Ohio. Behind him lay the whip and the auction block. Ahead lay freedom. He had walked for 9 nights through thickets and back roads, following the North Star and trusting strangers whose faces he barely saw. Now, standing at the edge of the water, he whispered the same words hundreds before him had prayed: "Lord, carry me through." But the river did not care for prayers. Its current was strong, its chill bone deep. Josiah stripped to his shirt, tied his small bundle above his head, and stepped into the dark. The water bit like knives. Each stroke was a struggle against fear and exhaustion. Behind him, dogs barked, faint but real. Panic gave him strength. When he reached the center, chunks of ice drifted past, scraping his skin. His breath came in gasps. Then, a light. On the opposite bank, a lantern flickered in a farmhouse window, the signal of a safe house run by John Rankin, a Presbyterian minister known across the nation for his defiance of slavery. Rankin's home sat high on a hill overlooking the river, its light visible for miles. Many fugitives called it their first sight of freedom. Rankin had once said, "While one man is enslaved, no man is truly free." For decades, he and his family sheltered runaways, hiding them in cellars and barns before passing them on to other conductors. When Josiah stumbled onto the shore, half frozen, Rankin's sons carried him inside, wrapped him in blankets, and gave him warm milk to drink. It was the first night Josiah had ever slept without chains. The Rankin house was not alone. Along the Ohio River, in towns like Ripley, Madison, and Cincinnati, a network of abolitionists, Quakers, and freed blacks formed an invisible chain of aid. Some ferried fugitives across the river in skiffs under cover of darkness. Others built hidden rooms behind fireplaces or under floorboards. Farmers left coded signals, a lantern, a quilt, a certain pattern of stones to mark safety. But danger never vanished completely. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant that even in free states, slave catchers had legal authority to capture escapees and return them south. Josiah knew he had to keep moving. With guidance from the Rankins, he followed the secret trails north toward Sandusky, where sympathetic sailors ferried freedom seekers across Lake Erie into Canada, beyond the reach of American law. Every crossing left ripples in history. The Ohio River became known as the River Jordan, a biblical symbol of deliverance. For every Josiah who made it across, there were others who vanished, drowned, captured, or betrayed. Yet stories of success spread like wildfire, inspiring more to follow. The line that once divided slavery from freedom became a line of rebellion, crossed again and again by those who refused to live in chains. In one of the most famous escapes, Margaret Garner, a young mother, crossed the frozen Ohio in 1856 with her husband and children. Cornered by slave catchers in Cincinnati, she made an unthinkable choice, taking her child's life rather than allowing her to be returned to slavery. Her story shocked the nation and later inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe's
Uncle Tom's Cabin. The Ohio River, once seen as a symbol of salvation, also bore witness to unbearable tragedy. By the time of the Civil War, the Ohio River had become more than a boundary. It was a moral frontier. Freedom and slavery, courage and cruelty met upon its waters. Those who crossed it carried not just their bodies, but the hopes of generations yet unborn. Josiah's story ended in Canada, where he built a small farm near Windsor, Ontario. He married, raised children, and told them of the night the river almost swallowed him whole. Freedom, he said, is never given. It must be crossed for.
Canada, the promised land. Beyond the border lay new lives, free soil, new names, and the first taste of dignity denied for generations. The wind off Lake Erie bit at their faces, but no one complained. The night was dark, the boat leaking, the oars whispering through black water. Behind them lay the land of chains. Ahead, just beyond the fog, lay Canada, the promised land. For those who had fled through the shadows of the Underground Railroad, it was not simply a country, it was a dream made real, a place where a human being could finally breathe free. In the mid-1800s, freedom in the United States was a fragile thing. Even if an enslaved person managed to reach the free states north of the Ohio River, safety was never guaranteed. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 allowed slave catchers to hunt escapees anywhere in the Union. Entire families who had crossed thousands of miles could be seized in broad daylight and dragged back south in irons. But across the border, in British North America, modern-day Canada, the law was different. There, slavery had been abolished in 1834, and the Crown refused to extradite fugitives. For the first time, the dream of permanent safety seemed possible. Word spread through the plantations like fire and dry grass. Go north to Canada. Freedom lives there. By night, hundreds began the final leg of their journey. They followed the secret routes of the Underground Railroad, crossing the Ohio River, slipping through Indiana and Michigan, and hiding in barns or beneath wagon loads of hay. The final obstacle was Lake Erie or the Detroit River, both wide and treacherous. Crossing meant trusting strangers, sailors, ferrymen, and abolitionists who risked prison or worse for helping them. One of those ferrymen was Captain John Brown, an abolitionist whose small boat made dozens of night runs across Lake Erie. He carried families shivering in silence, their few possessions tied in rags. Some wept as they stepped onto Canadian soil, falling to their knees to kiss the ground. For the first time in their lives, no man could claim ownership of their bodies. In cities like Windsor, Ontario, Chatham, Buxton, and St. Catharines, new communities of fugitive slaves began to rise. They called themselves fugitive slaves no more. They were free men, craftsmen, farmers, and citizens. Small cabins sprang up on land purchased by abolitionist societies and sympathetic churches. Schools were built for children who had once been forbidden to read. Churches rang with hymns of joy, their congregations made up of those who had walked through hell to reach heaven's edge. Among them was Harriet Tubman, the legendary Moses of her people. After guiding dozens to safety through the Underground Railroad, she settled in St. Catharines, Ontario, using it as her northern base. From there, she planned more rescue missions, venturing back into the South despite the price on her head. To her, freedom was not complete until every soul was delivered. She said, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." The Canadian towns that welcomed these new citizens became beacons of hope for the enslaved still trapped below the border. In Buxton, Reverend William King founded the Elgin Settlement, a model community for freedmen. It had brick homes, schools, and a church, proof that formerly enslaved people could build, learn, and lead when given a chance. In Chatham, black farmers cultivated rich soil and established thriving businesses. Their children went to school beside white Canadians, something almost unthinkable in America at the time. But freedom did not mean the end of hardship. The climate was harsh, and many arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Prejudice existed even in Canada, though never enforced by law. Yet the arrivals endured, because the simplest acts, walking unchained, owning land, sending a child to school, were worth every struggle. As one freedman named Josiah Henson, whose life later inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin, wrote, "Here I found that I was a man, not a piece of property. My wife was my own, my children were my own, and no hand could take them from me." By 1860, an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 formerly enslaved people had made their way into Canada via the Underground Railroad. They built not just homes, but legacies, publishing newspapers, serving in militias, and even fighting for the Union during the Civil War. Their descendants became teachers, activists, and soldiers, living proof that freedom once seized could never again be taken quietly.
The railroad's hidden engineers. Behind every escape was a network of unsung heroes, black and white, rich and poor, united by the belief that freedom had no color. They had no trains, no tracks, and no tickets. Yet they ran one of the most daring networks in American history. By lantern light and whispered codes, a secret army of ordinary people, farmers, preachers, merchants, and mothers, defied the law to move human souls toward freedom. They called it the Underground Railroad, and its hidden engineers built it not from iron and steam, but from courage, faith, and love. In the dark years before the Civil War, when slavery still ruled the American South, every escape to freedom was a miracle of coordination and trust. Those who fled, the freedom seekers, did not run blindly. They followed a map etched in memory, carried through songs, and guarded by a secret network of allies. These allies were known as conductors, station masters, and engineers, though their titles were only metaphors. Together, they formed an invisible system of defiance stretching from the deep south to the Canadian border. The railroad had no central leadership. It was a decentralized web of humanity. Its engineers came from every walk of life, black and white, rich and poor, men and women, free and enslaved. Their shared belief was simple yet revolutionary, that no human being should own another. Among the first and bravest of these was Harriet Tubman, the legendary Moses of her people. A woman barely 5 feet tall, born into slavery in Maryland, Tubman escaped in 1849, only to return again and again to rescue others. Over the next decade, she made at least 13 journeys south, leading more than 70 people to freedom and advising hundreds more. Her network stretched through Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New York, using hidden safe houses and sympathetic allies. Tubman carried a pistol not to threaten slave catchers, but to give courage to those who might turn back. She told them, "You'll be free or you'll die here." But Tubman did not work alone. Behind her stood a vast network of supporters, the hidden engineers who kept the Underground Railroad running. In Philadelphia, William Still, a free black man and member of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, acted as a kind of record keeper for the Underground Railroad. His modest office became one of the busiest stations in the country. Still interviewed every fugitive who passed through, documenting their names, stories, and destinations. His notes, hidden for decades, later became a treasure of history, proof of more than 800 escapes he helped orchestrate. Meanwhile, across the Ohio River in Ripley, Ohio, John Rankin, a white Presbyterian minister, became another vital engineer. His house, perched high on a hill overlooking the river, shone a lantern in its window, a beacon of hope for those crossing from Kentucky's slave territory. Rankin's home sheltered hundreds, and his letters inspired abolitionists nationwide. Slave catchers threatened him often, but he never backed down. "If the cause of humanity requires it, I am ready to perish," he once said. And then there were those whose names history nearly forgot, the black engineers who risked even more. Many were free-born Northerners. Others were former slaves who returned south to help their kin. Henry Box Brown mailed himself from Richmond to Philadelphia in a wooden crate, then used his newfound freedom to lecture and raise funds for others' escapes. Francis Harper, a black poet and abolitionist, wrote fiery speeches and organized anti-slavery meetings disguised as church gatherings. Frederick Douglass, once enslaved himself, turned his Rochester home into a key station, writing passes and arranging routes for fugitives on their way to Canada. Each journey demanded precise timing and iron will. Conductors coordinated safe houses spaced about 10 to 15 miles apart, the distance a traveler could walk in a single night. Farmers disguised fugitives as field hands. Preachers hid them in church basements. Women sewed messages into quilts or baked food with hidden signals inside. Even children acted as lookouts, playing games near roads where slave catchers might appear. The risks were immense. Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, anyone aiding an escaped slave faced heavy fines or imprisonment. A single mistake could destroy dozens of lives. Yet the network endured, not through power or wealth, but through shared conviction. By the dawn of the Civil War, the Underground Railroad had helped tens of thousands of enslaved people reach safety, though exact numbers remain unknown. Its engineers changed not only lives, but the conscience of a nation. Their work inspired writers, ministers, and politicians who would ultimately push the country toward abolition. When the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, many conductors quietly returned to their farms and churches, their mission complete. Few sought recognition. As Levi Coffin later wrote, "We did our work in secret, and we asked for no reward."
Echoes of liberation. Long after the Civil War, the spirit of the Underground Railroad lived on, a testament to courage, unity, and the unbreakable will to be free. Imagine walking along a quiet country lane in Ohio, centuries after the last lanterns flickered in farmhouse windows, and hearing whispers of courage carried on the wind. These are not just echoes of the past. They are the enduring heartbeat of the Underground Railroad, a network that changed America forever. Long after the guns fell silent and the Civil War ended, the spirit of freedom that guided fugitive slaves north continued to shape lives, communities, and the conscience of a nation. In 1865, the country was battered and raw. 4 years of civil war had left the landscape scarred, families broken, and millions of formerly enslaved people suddenly thrust into freedom. But freedom, while legally granted through the 13th Amendment, was not easily claimed. The journey from bondage to dignity had been treacherous, and the lessons learned along the Underground Railroad were now more vital than ever. The railroad had always been about more than escaping chains. It was a symbol of human solidarity, where black and white, rich and poor, risked life and limb to uphold a moral truth, that no person should be enslaved. Its legacy did not end when the last passenger crossed the Ohio River or reached Canadian soil. It continued in the courage, self-reliance, and community spirit instilled in those who had once been fugitives. Take, for example, Josiah Henson, a man whose life epitomized this spirit.
Born enslaved in Kentucky, he escaped across the Ohio River to Canada, guided by conductors of the Underground Railroad. There, in Ontario, he founded a settlement for formerly enslaved people, a place where education, trade, and faith were cornerstones of freedom. Henson's story inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, but his real legacy lay in the communities he nurtured. Through schools, churches, and farms, he empowered people who had once been treated as property to reclaim agency over their lives. Henson's settlement was not unique. Across Canada, in towns like Windsor, Buxton, and Chatham, networks of formerly enslaved people created thriving communities. Families planted crops, built homes, and sent their children to schools where literacy was not forbidden. Former conductors and freedom seekers became mentors, passing down the knowledge of survival, secrecy, and courage that had allowed them to navigate the Underground Railroad. But the echoes of liberation did not remain confined to the North or Canada. Back in the United States, those who had survived the escape and those who had facilitated it carried the lessons of solidarity into Reconstruction. They understood that freedom was fragile without community. Churches became meeting places not just for worship, but for organizing schools, sharing news, and protecting one another from lingering threats like the Ku Klux Klan and systemic oppression. Harriet Tubman, the legendary conductor, continued her work long after the Civil War. She advocated for women's suffrage, fought for civil rights, and helped establish schools for freedmen. Tubman's courage inspired countless fugitives during the war, but it also fueled a post-war vision, a society in which freedom was active, not just granted. Every life she touched became a beacon of the railroad's enduring ethos. Freedom required vigilance, unity, and moral courage. Even the hidden engineers, the Quakers, preachers, and Northern sympathizers who had once risked fines and imprisonment left behind legacies that would echo for generations. Families like the Coffins of Indiana, who had helped thousands of fugitives, invested their energy into education and philanthropy, ensuring that the lessons of the Underground Railroad were preserved. Their hidden acts of defiance became public testaments to the power of ordinary people united by conscience. Through letters, diaries, and later published memoirs, the stories of the railroad's conductors and passengers inspired new generations of activists. Abolitionist ideals transitioned into movements for civil rights, suffrage, and social justice. The moral courage once displayed under the threat of law and death became a blueprint for civic action in the United States. The Underground Railroad also shaped culture in enduring ways. Quilts, songs, hymns, and oral traditions were preserved and celebrated in communities that had once been bound by slavery. Songs like "Follow the Drinking Gourd" continued to be sung in schools and churches, now as educational tools and cultural touchstones. Quilts that had guided freedom seekers became artifacts, symbols of ingenuity and coded communication. Museums and historical societies began chronicling these stories, ensuring that the railroad's hidden engineers would be remembered. Even today, scholars and descendants trace the routes once traveled under cover of night. Old barns, churches, and homes that served as stations are now landmarks. Markers along the Ohio River, in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and beyond commemorate the bravery of those who risked everything to help strangers walk into liberty. The railroad, though dismantled physically, left a moral infrastructure, a framework for courage and community that remains visible to this day. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Underground Railroad is the message it leaves for the present, that freedom is an active pursuit. It is not only a legal status, but a practice, a daily commitment to justice, solidarity, and empathy. The passengers and engineers of the railroad demonstrated that ordinary people could confront extraordinary oppression through quiet, deliberate acts of courage. They proved that moral action could bend the arc of history. The echoes of their liberation resonate not just in history books, but in the ongoing fight for equality and human dignity. From civil rights marches to grassroots activism, the lessons of the railroad continue to guide Americans striving for justice. The story of those who risked everything under the cover of night reminds us that freedom is never free, but it is always worth the risk.